Global 360, the show produced by the Washington Diplomat, which has been serving the diplomatic community here in DC for over 26 years now. I'm the managing editor, Anna Gavel, and I want to welcome our special guest today, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Stavros Lambrinidis. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So Ambassador Lambrinidis previously served as a member of the European Parliament, Greece's foreign minister, and the EU Special Envoy for Human Rights before coming here to Washington, D.C. in early 2019. I had the privilege to interview the ambassador just after he presented his credentials to the White House for his first media interview. He graciously sat through over an hour of questioning on pretty much every topic I could possibly think of at the time. So, Ambassador, I appreciate you willing to do this again for us, for me. And, you know, many of the issues that we touched on 2 years ago, whether it was trade, China, Iran, you know, are just as urgent and in many ways problematic as they are today. But that's certainly not to say things have not changed. They, of course, have changed dramatically so. 2 years ago, Donald Trump was president, and it was no secret he was not exactly the European Union's biggest fans. He started trade fights with the bloc, accused NATO of freeloading off of the U.S., and generally criticized the transatlantic alliance in a way that no other U.S. president had since, you know, really the formation of the European Union. Fast forward today, we have Joe Biden in the White House, and despite still being knee deep in a pandemic, made his widely anticipated first trip overseas to Europe, a deeply symbolic gesture that America is back on the world stage, and along with that, the EU-U.S. alliance. So, of course, the situation is day and night from 2 years ago, but that doesn't mean there isn't any daylight between Washington and Brussels, including on issues such as China that President Biden has deemed critical to his foreign policy agenda. The EU has its disagreements as well, notably at the moment, it is pressing the Biden administration to reciprocate on pandemic travel restrictions and allow European travelers to come to the U.S. And this, of course, gets to really the biggest issue we have all been grappling with, which is the pandemic, and which, despite the relatively successful vaccination campaigns, both here in the U.S. and now in much of Europe, is still raging across the globe and still threatens the U.S. and the EU as dangerous new variants emerge. So once again, just like 2 years ago, we have plenty to discuss. So Ambassador, let's dive straight in. You know, can you start by just briefly talking about President Biden's recent visit, not only the symbolism of it, but also the tangibles that were delivered specifically on the trade front, I know, in terms of the longstanding Boeing Airbus dispute? Yeah.
And it's so great to see you again, to be with you and Victor and everyone. And it's very timely we have this discussion a couple of weeks after the summit took place, because it was indeed the culmination of a very, very intense contacts between the Biden administration and the European Union since the inauguration. So it wasn't a one-off. You know, the president here participated virtually at a meeting of the European leaders a couple of months before. Secretary Blinken had been a number of times already to Brussels, and so many others. So there's clearly a change in tone, but there's also beginning to be a very serious change in substance. This change in tone is in itself hugely important, especially as we signal in the midst of COVID and getting out of it to the rest of the world that the two biggest open societies of the world, America and Europe, are on the same page and are working together to address the challenges. I say this because COVID showed us that a number of other major countries around the world were trying to fill in what they perceived as being black holes of power left by the US withdrawing from the multilateral system or from the EU-U.S. alliance as they saw it. Well, that's not longer the case. I think a very important message of this summit was to all those around the world who you know, are intent on promoting authoritarian models of government or economic models of government that are non-market based and are distortive It's a message that they should stand up and listen, because now the EU and the US are back together. It's also a message of hope to many around the world who are willing to promote those values, the values that we share, but who may have felt slightly abandoned or confused as to where exactly we stand. Now, having said that, we're not out of the woods ourselves on many of these issues. So what we discussed in this summit, if you like, Anna, are three things. One, how we are each other's biggest provider of prosperity. We have always been that, and we continue to be that. Our two economies are more interconnected than any other economies in the world. We create more jobs in each other through our trade and investment than anyone else creates in our economies. We make more profits. We bring more food to working families' tables. We support our consumers in our industry better than anyone else. The second big theme is that we are each other's biggest security provider. And there is absolutely no question when you look at the summit conclusions, including the agreement that we have for the first time to launch an EU-U.S. defense dialogue, that both through NATO and our general umbrella, but also through an increased EU presence in its neighborhood around the world, that we have to look at the defense implications, but also more broadly, we have to look at the issues of migration together, and we establish a new dialogue on that. What are the root causes? How does one best address them? How does one reach out to the ground, helping people from reaching the point of desperation, whether because of war or because of extreme poverty or what have you? And then the third thing is that we are the world's open societies, democracies are the world's biggest providers of fair global public goods. And let's not forget this now. When it comes from anything to addressing climate and the climate crisis, to ensuring that artificial intelligence that is taking over our lives all over the world will be based on human rights standards, and it will not be used for repressive purposes. When it comes to human rights more broadly, when it comes to issues of connectivity and investments around the world, the massive trillion euro worth of investments that are taking place, and that China through Belt and Road and others are trying to fill the gap. But in fact, they're doing it in a way that very often creates untenable economic situations from other countries. The big open societies of the world are the biggest providers of global public goods. And if you look at our summit conclusions, you will see that in there as well. So it was very hopeful. But Anna, you mentioned Airbus, Boeing. And so I want to address that very quickly. This is the longest standing dispute, trade dispute. And you know what? COVID, if it hit any industry more than any other industry, was the airline industry and the travel industry. As we're coming out of COVID, trying to create the economies that will do this for the future, the best message we would have sent, not just to the airline industry, but to the thousands of companies supplying it, was that we are mature enough as partners to put a brake, to ground, if you like, this dispute. And we did so. We gave us 5 years to discuss all the details of support to the industry, to see how it can happen without harming each other's interests. But we also emphasized that we have to work together to look at the new challenges of countries that are non-market economies that have been developing their own airline industry. And China, of course, is the major example, but not the only one, to ensure that we can protect the interests of our workers and our companies. So that was a big successful thing. We haven't resolved everything, but I'm sure your questions will take us to other trade and other issues.
So on that note, what a perfect segue. But yeah, I mean, obviously the Boeing Airbus truce was a significant accomplishment. This has been a dispute that's been ongoing for 17 years. But as you said, there are other trade irritants, and namely one of the more important ones are the import taxes on European steel and aluminum that Donald Trump imposed and that Joe Biden has yet to lift. Now, I know you've recently said the issue could be resolved before EU countermeasures go into effect this December. Can you elaborate on what it will take to reach that settlement? And also, by extension, do you think an agreement will kind of quell the anger that many Europeans have felt with when these tariffs were imposed under the guise of national security concerns?
Yes, I believe so. I believe a lot of that anger that you described has already been quelled by the very positive engagement that we have now, of course, with the new administration. But there are some real issues out there. Those steel aluminum tariffs against European companies were imposed on the grounds that Europe presented a national security threat to the U.S. through steel aluminum. That's not just a ridiculous concept to begin with, but it was also illegal under WTO rules to impose them. So the end result was that we had, as the EU, then to use our own rights to retaliate, and we did. We imposed, our own tariffs on a number of U.S. products. And this June 2021, under WTO rules, we could have doubled those. And we decided that as a major gesture of goodwill, we would not do so. We would postpone that right to redouble them, to double them for 6 months. And then we decided at the summit, President Biden and President von der Leyen and President Michel on the EU side, that we're going to set a dialogue to resolve the issue, which is fundamentally overcapacity, especially by China. So Europe, if anything, in the past year, exported less steel to the U.S. than it did before, whereas China, which was creating the problem by having huge overcapacity and therefore very cheap steel aluminum that could flood world markets, it actually increased its overcapacity. In other words, those tariffs against the EU, didn't work at all to quell the problem for the US industry, but also for the EU industry, because we as well are threatened by this overcapacity. So the answer to your question is, in those 5.5 months left, we are going to be focusing very hard to find a resolution to the overcapacity problem. We're going to try to set up the mechanism that ensure that we can detect it quickly and that we can resolve any issues that come up quickly. And I think we are entirely capable of doing it. This is a sensitive issue, both in the EU and the US. You do have workers working in the steel industry. In this country, certainly, we know, in some very sensitive and important US states, but in Europe as well. We have had, thousands of companies, not just the steel industry, but also others that have suffered from the US tariffs. So can there be a better message that we are back in business together than ensuring that by the end of the year, the US lifts its tariffs and then the EU automatically lifts its own tariffs? I don't think so. I think that's a great message. And one last thing, because these things are so complex all the time. And you and I know this because we follow, the details. When you look at steel and the price of steel, well, it's not just the industry that manufactures it, it's also the industries that consume it. So there are so many industries in the US that consume steel. After those steel tariffs against the EU, what has happened is the price of steel actually in the US has gone up, in many cases dramatically. So only a month and a half ago, we had about 300 US manufacturers that came out with a statement asking the Biden administration to lift its steel aluminum tariffs against the EU, so the EU could also lift its own tariffs, saying that, we are suffering with these tariffs. We are paying much more for the input of steel, and our workers here in the US, our companies here in the US are becoming less competitive. So there is such a domino effect every time you do something like this. And my hope is that we Americans and Europeans will be able to focus on the forest, not the trees, Chinese overcapacity, and be able to support each other and protect our industries.
So now, of course, you've mentioned China, and as we all know, China looms large in so many of these trade issues, but not just that, in terms of so many other issues in the transatlantic alliance. Now, Donald Trump outright named China as a competitor, and it's a policy Joe Biden has largely continued, although he has said there is room for some cooperation. But it's clear that the US now views China largely as an adversary. And while the EU also identifies China as a rival, some in the US, including many Republicans, say the EU isn't as united in terms of aggressively confronting China on issues such as Huawei, for example, especially given the strong ties with economic ties with Beijing that many member states do have. So how do you address the concerns that the EU has, too many divergent interests to forcefully confront China and align its policies with the Biden administration? And then also, are there areas where the EU is simply not in alignment with the Biden administration because it doesn't necessarily agree with those policies?
So, first point, when it comes to China, we're sitting on the same side of the table. Have no doubt about that, and neither should China, and they know it. And if you look at our summit statement on the 15th of June, you will see that very clearly. Secondly, yes, we don't agree on everything, but we most certainly agree on identifying the malady. China is a repressive country when it comes to democracy and human rights, and it's also a country with a huge state footprint on the economy and non-market economy, and one that plays very unfairly and increasingly so when it comes to trade investment, equal access to its market, and all those things. Now, we don't always agree on everything that has to do with the remedy to that malady. In other words, exactly the kind of the medicine, the dosage of the medicine, if you like, that needs to be used. But those differences are being overblown because fundamentally we fully agree and are getting much more aligned on a number of things. So we also decided now here in the summit that we'll be establishing a very positive trade agenda, the Trade and Technology Council, where the EU and the US will look at every single element and aspect of new tech, whether it is robotics or AI or 5G or anything you want there, but also the more policy part of that equation. So export controls, foreign direct investment screenings, for example. So we're going to be looking and setting standards for artificial intelligence and other stuff that are human rights perspective. So we are going to be working together on some of the biggest challenges of our times that also address Chinese challenges. At the same time, Anna, I want to stress something that is very, very important, in my view at least. If we're going to win in this new innovation technology era, we simply have to run faster than China or anyone else. We can't simply be playing defense. And running faster means massive investments in the two biggest innovative economies in the world, the EU and the US, to encourage the kind of innovation that is necessary for the 21st century. Working together to develop new technologies, to produce them, to scale them when it comes to things like new green technologies, which is where the future is going. Someone is going to be opening up those markets, and it's got to be us, because we have all the potential and all the capacity. So if you think of it that way, running faster is going to be and has to be the biggest challenge that both Americans and Europeans face. And that requires an entirely different kind of thinking than simply saying, let's bash someone, let's change them. I mean, China probably will not change from one day to the other into a major flourishing democracy. So I'm not going to waste all my time figuring out how to change them altogether, although I will certainly keep the pressure on. I'm going to focusing on running faster. But if I run faster, I got to do the second thing as well, which is I got to protect my runners. So, all the unfair trade practices that China has up to now, these you need to have instruments, both bilateral instruments and multilateral ones to address. We in Europe, we have a whole toolkit. You mentioned 5G. We have a 5G toolkit to mitigate the risks of foreign investments if they come from suppliers that are being controlled by foreign governments or who are unreliable. And most EU member states today have made decisions on the basis of this joint European approach to security, 5G security, that are excluding those suppliers, including Huawei. We have new regulations and laws in the pipeline to deal with the access of subsidized enterprises to the European Union market. You cannot be not allowing access to your market and then expect that your fully subsidized companies will be coming in and buying up European companies or investing massively and taking jobs away from Europeans. Either you level the playing field first, or you're not going to be playing. At least you're not going to be playing with me, and I am the second biggest market in the world after the US is. So so you have to run faster, you have to protect the runners, and we have all these instruments in place or in the pipeline. And we agreed we're going to be working together, Americans and Europeans, to try to coordinate on those instruments and the standards of the future. Am I hopeful? Yes, I am.
So, well, and certainly China is one of the rare areas where you've seen bipartisan agreement here in Congress, where there has been a bill in terms of investment that's gone through the Senate. Of course, still needs to go for the House. And as you know, as an observer of Congress, the devil is in the details. So we will see how that pans out. But
speaking of now, you're one of the most distinguished journalists in this town.
I
you might give me a tip. You might give me a tip or two.
I make no predictions, although if you have to put your money on something, it might be that bill. But again, the House is a very different beast than the Senate, as you well know. So that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But before we move into the pandemic, I want to touch on another priority for President Biden, which of course is Russia. And here we see a lot of the same concerns as we do with China, that the EU is reliant economically, but really more so in terms of Russia on energy here. And I think an interesting kind of microcosm of this debate is Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which will significantly increase Russian gas supplies to Europe, in part by bypassing Ukraine. President Biden recently waived sanctions on the project, which I should note is already more than 90% complete. But of course, a number of Republicans and Democrats have pushed back and are making an effort in the House to try and stop those sanctions waivers. So what is the EU's official position regarding Nord Stream 2 and the larger criticism that this will make the EU overly reliant on Russia at a time when, especially the Biden administration, is facing a lot of cyber attacks from Russia?
Well, I mean, certainly Russia is another major country that we're concerned about. And at the same time that we set up a special dialogue between us on China, in the summit, we also set up a special dialogue between us to address the Russia challenge. And Russia is a challenge, is a different challenge for the U.S. than for the EU. We share a geography, a history, and it's a very important relationship to be able to cultivate. But the Russia of today doesn't seem to have not just a desire to do so, but it's taken steps that indicate that it cannot be relied upon as a country that abides by international law and rules. And of course, Crimea and Ukraine is one example, but not the only example there. So we're quite concerned. But when it comes to the issue of Nord Stream 2 that you mentioned, this is not a European project or a project of European interest. This is a project, that some member states are involved in the EU, and where Europe comes in is in basically two ways. The one is that we have ensured, and all our member states have agreed on this, that we amended the European laws to say that any pipeline that comes into the EU from anywhere in the world has to focus on and abide by European laws. Up to that point, up to 2 years ago, the parts of pipelines that were outside the European territory were not covered by this obligation. That means that no matter what Russia or anyone else does with any pipelines, they cannot but apply European laws, including laws that force you to unbundle, the supplier of gas to the distributor of gas, laws that force you to allow all gas suppliers to be in there together. And when it comes to Ukraine, of course, that we have facilitated the negotiation of the extension of the agreement between Russia and Ukraine, that for a while was problematic. The second thing that we care about as Europeans is to ensure energy diversification in the EU itself. And what is simply clear, and again, the discussion on Nord Stream 2 has, in my view, obscured the forest for the trees, is that the European Union announced unanimously, all 27 member states, and without reservation, that as we come out of COVID, we will be investing massively in green transition and new energy technologies. And we also announced in the summit itself that we will stop funding, Americans and Europeans, carbon supported, electricity energy production by the end of 2021, all these things mean something very simple. Whether you're in coal or whether you are in gas, well, coal, it's history. Gas is a very important transition fuel, but even that, eventually, and not in the all too distant future, will lose significance. They're going to be much cleaner technologies, and the real question there is, can we in Europe, who are already quite advanced in terms of developing and innovating on them, together with our US partners, find areas in which we can work together, whether it is on energy storage, which is so important if you're going to move to green technology, or whether it is on energy transfer, or whether it is on some specific technologies, hydrogen, offshore wind, that we can work together to deploy them faster and to create the first mover advantage around the world. I think that we can. So that is the forest. The other stuff is something that, well, I would say a third thing, a third European interest, and I would just, I don't want to, put too much of a point on it, but I do want to say that we have repeatedly said, and we are working very closely now with the US, that the use of extraterritorial sanctions is not something that is acceptable under territorial law, international law. So for me to decide, I'm going to punish you, the US, for something you did because I don't like it, or because I think it's in your best interest, for example. And EU and US have always shown that when we work together on sanctions, whether it was to get Iran to the table and eventually to force it to sign the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, or whether it is today, where we are coordinating remarkably well on sanctions from Russia for Navalny, to China for Xinjiang, to Belarus, or to Myanmar. Working together is important. Now, that to me means that when it comes to energy, we should not be threatening each other with sanctions. What we should be doing is focusing on how we work together effectively to win the future. And it's in our grasp. It's right here. We can do it.
Well, and that would get to one of the many changes between the administration, because as you know, President Biden is working to shift the sanctions policy here in the US from one that, will have less detrimental effects on the general public and will be done more in concert with allies. So of course we could go into climate change. I don't know if Congress will see its way through that forest into the summer or the fall, but I know our time is limited. So I want to switch gears here to the pandemic. And now obviously the EU has made tremendous strides vaccinating its people after what many perceived as a sluggish, botched start. At least in comparison here to the US. Brussels, as you well know, was criticized over taking too long to approve a lot of the vaccines, exporting some of the supplies, and in many ways the same problem that we had here of not having the infrastructure in place to distribute the supplies it did have. But today the EU is only slightly behind America's vaccination rate. It's about nearly half of its population has been at least partially vaccinated. So Ambassador, this is, a very broad kind of two-part question here. Can you tell us about where the vaccination effort stands and where it hopes to go, specifically in terms of addressing the vaccine hesitancy now, which is the issue that we're having here in the US, and then also looking back on kind of the lessons that were learned in terms of the EU's vaccine rollout?
Yeah. Now we have vaccinated in Europe. Our numbers are dramatically improving by the day, not even by the week. We have vaccinated in many of our member states with at least one vaccine, even a bigger percentage of our population than the US has. And we are confident that within July, 70% of the EU population will be vaccinated. We did start slow. But that was partly because of two reasons. The first one was that we had a huge issue with one of the suppliers in Europe who had promised to us and contracted to deliver a certain amount of millions of vaccines, and then suddenly didn't do it for a long time.
So we're talking AstraZeneca.
AstraZeneca. And the second reason that we started slow is because we were the only producer of vaccines in the world, the EU, that allowed for the export of those vaccines to other countries from day one. So what is remarkable and many Americans don't know is that today, the success numbers in Europe, and it's not a competition, but it's very good news. The success numbers in Europe that are so high have happened in spite of the fact that we have allowed for the export of as many vaccines, about 400 million, as many vaccines to other countries as we have put in European citizens' hands. Now, we could have kept those 400 million vaccines for ourselves, but guess what? Guess who would have been getting the advantage and the celebration, acting as Mother Teresa's of the world and pretending that, in fact, it is authoritarians who are the better providers of global public goods than democracies and open societies. Well, we didn't want that to happen. We felt it was our ethical obligation, in addition to our political interests, to ensure that people around the world got vaccinated by vaccines that were produced in Europe. And also, frankly, in this case, as in many others, solidarity is not charity, because we all know, sorry for the, for the triteness of the statement, unless everyone is safe, no one is. And we see now with the variants. So we are in a real now race. And that race is to vaccinate people faster than the variants develop, both in Europe, because we have the Delta variant as well. So very good numbers. Not only are we not sitting back and patting ourselves in the back, but we are pushing even harder for more people to be vaccinated, because that's the best way to ensure the variants don't catch you. But also we have committed, together with the United States at the summit now and the G7 before, because now we are in very, very close coordination and cooperation to create a COVID vaccines supply chain working group. So we work together to see how we produce better, how we ensure the supply chains are open, how we avoid unnecessary export restrictions, and how we help production capacity in other countries around the world today. We, the EU, already committed €1 billion to build production capacity in Africa. So that is what gives me hope. What have we learned for the future? We need to monitor these pandemics before they happen much better. Mm-hmm. The WHO has to be supported to do a better job in this, but we also need to use our own people to do this better. We need to share much faster the information we have about the DNA of any particular virus, and to be able then to work together all over the world, our best minds to address and attack it. We absolutely have to deal with and be prepared for disinformation and misinformation. And that's not just the malign element of a third country that is trying to pass a message that democracies are inefficient and not good and all that stuff that was happening at the beginning. But it's also within our own societies. Anna, within our own societies. I mean, we have in Europe as well people, thankfully, the vast minority, but we have people who are out there spreading all these stories and all these theories about vaccines. And you know what? The more that happens, the more people will be dying. So we cannot allow that. We have to be much better prepared. Production capacity and facility and sharing vaccines, that's another thing. And finally, supply chains more broadly. We saw vulnerabilities here.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure, as you know, there's a certain irony here where at the really start of the vaccination campaign, many EU citizens were criticizing the bloc for exporting vaccines. And now the EU, similar to the US, has come under fire from many developing nations, particularly those more recently in Africa, who are urging the EU to relax restrictions on vaccine exports so that they can buy more doses. So it's really not always an issue of donating financial contributions to COVAX, for instance, but these countries are demanding actual doses right now. So, what do you say, this is a similar issue that the Biden administration is facing. What do you say to countries who are saying, we need the doses, not just the production capacity?
All right, so look, there are 4 things that get vaccines to people. The first thing is exports. In exports, the European Union has not restricted among thousands of applications, but only one export many months ago to Australia. The second thing, so everything that is produced in Europe that is destined to go to other countries around the world, we have allowed that to happen. And that has not been the case, as you know, with other major producers of vaccines around the world. The second thing that you have is indeed COVAX. And that is the mechanism that, again, the EU took the leadership at the beginning of the pandemic to help set up with, G20 and other countries around the world, and also a lot of major private donors, to ensure that vaccines and pharmaceuticals could go fast and at cost or at zero cost, especially to low and middle income countries, right? The third way that you can get vaccines out is donations. And that is what the EU, Team Europe, as we say, so the EU and its member states together, have been doing already in many parts of the world, especially Africa, but have committed by the end of the year to donate at least 100 million doses of vaccines. In other words, vaccines that we have bought, through the process that we have. And then they go to other countries. And the fourth thing is manufacturing capacity. So you need to be able to manufacture more. And that is where we are coming in with a proposal we have submitted to the WTO, in which we're saying, this is what we need to be doing to increase manufacturing capacity in different countries through voluntary agreements to ensure that, if our own capacity, as ramped up as we try to make it, isn't enough, we can produce more stuff there. So it's not rocket science. It's complicated, but it's not rocket science. The EU has only to be, in my view at least, proud for the fact that we allowed for the maximum export of vaccines and for the maximum use of all four of these pillars to ensure that countries, especially people in poor countries, get the vaccines. And I was speaking to the chairman of Pfizer when the vaccine was first developed. He is a Greek, by the way, so that may explain the discussion. Albert Bourla, and and it was very interesting because he was telling me, and this is exactly what we're focusing now, together with our U.S. partners, when we're looking at donations of vaccines and other stuff like that. You may be shooting for a 70% or 75% herd immunity, right? And that's hundreds of millions of people. But if you manage to identify the real critical people, who are usually about 10 to 15% of any particular population, so the medical workers, those who work at the supermarket, those who are the older people, in other words, those who are most likely to die if they catch the vaccine, or who are most likely to catch the vaccine and then pass it over. If you focus on that 15%, then you may not have reached herd immunity, but you will have reached the point where chances of the vaccine rapidly expanding and running around are dramatically reduced, and chances of people dying if they catch it are dramatically reduced as well. So you need to be smart as you're unfolding this, not only, as you said, have the right delivery capacity, which was a challenge in the US, but also identify with local governments who are the right people immediately, not allow this to just go on forever. And if you do that, you're reducing the risks for everyone's lives around the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know this is a huge issue for you at the moment as the summer tourist season is becoming in full swing. You do have now quite a number of Europeans that have been vaccinated. A lot of the restrictions for Americans to go to Europe have been eased, but the same cannot be said for Europeans wanting to travel here to the U.S. So I know that's a major issue that you're in discussions with the Biden administration. Has the White House been receptive to your case? And then also, is it wise at the moment to be lifting any kind of restrictions given the emergence of the dangerous new Delta variant?
Well, it all has to be based on safety, and it all has to be based on science. So that's what we're saying. Science is telling us that the vaccines are effective at this stage against the variants that we know, and that the vaccines are dramatically effective in both preventing you from catching COVID, and even if you do, from bringing you to a critical state, right? So the vaccines are doing what vaccines are supposed to do, and that is supremely important. And when you see that, and when we saw that in Europe, we said, okay, this is what's going to happen. First of all, we're going to have domestically We're going to ensure that we can travel in each other's country again without restrictions if we have what is called a COVID certificate, which fundamentally in a reliable way indicates if you've gotten a vaccine, if you've gotten a reliable test that is negative, or if you've caught COVID and therefore have the antibodies. And that is making a huge difference in opening up the European economy. The European economy is moving now on all four cylinders faster than it was even expected 3 months ago, precisely because we have used the scientific method to allow this. Then we said, well, you know what? We have to look at countries that have similar levels of vaccination with us, and then we have to ensure that we allow them as well to travel here to Europe, and for us to be able to travel to them, given that we are so highly vaccinated. But even if someone is not vaccinated, if they come from a country that has very low cases, then they should also be able to travel to Europe, provided that they follow all the health and safety measures, including quarantines, regular testing, whatever it is that any one of our 27 member states has in place. And the only country like that today, or one of the very few ones, is the United States. So last month we decided that the US, if you're an American citizen, if you're vaccinated, you can travel to Europe and do business and enjoy vacation, all that. If you're not vaccinated, then you have to take the test, you have to do everything, but you can also travel. The US side, unfortunately, has not reciprocated at this stage, and we are in discussions, and the summit agreed that we're going to have continued discussions on these. I hope that we can resolve this issue very quickly, because it's, you know, you have to, again, I say, you have to base it on science. In the US case, the European Union, the so-called Schengen area, were one of the very few areas of the world that were blocked from traveling to the US after the pandemic hit, and even today. So, you know, China, the EU, Brazil, I believe, leave maybe 3 or 4 other countries. If you were in India, you could travel to the US throughout the pandemic until just a few days ago, you know, maybe a month ago. If you were not in any country in the world, you could do it. So when you're in a situation now where the EU and the US are the two most highly vaccinated, lowest cases, you know, and lowest death areas in the world, and when you look at the tremendous economic and personal interest that exists for our economies, our societies, our workers, our businesses to be able to open up safely, I underline, you have to use the science to do it. And is there a human element here, Anna? Absolutely. Listen, we in Europe allowed for Americans who had valid work permits working in Europe to keep traveling back and forth with testing and all those things, of course, safely. Quarantines if necessary throughout the pandemic. So if you're an American with a valid, you know, work permit in Europe, you will never stop from visiting your family in the US. You will never stop from traveling back and forth to make sure your business, you know, could continue producing, doing new things. For Europeans, on the other hand, holding a valid work visa in the US, travel was blocked when the whole Schengen area was blocked. So I can be a European working for years and years in this country, having a family in this country, fully vaccinated by a vaccine that I got at the CVS in my neighborhood in Washington, DC, and I'm still not allowed to travel back and see my family or to go do business to Europe, because I'm not sure I'll be allowed to come back to the US. So there are elements here that we have an economic interest, a broader interest in the transatlantic partnership to address, and I hope that we can find a solution here as well in the US very shortly. I really do, because it's going to be great for the US economy as well.
Yeah. Well, so now, since you talked about the economy, I want to ask a question that we received from our audience, and I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions, but I wanted to get to this one. So the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was never concluded. We know things were very different under former President Trump. Now, I know there are so many other priorities taking place. So the question here is there any kind of momentum for an EU-U.S. trade partnership? And I want to add on my own question to that, because I always have to have the last word, is, you know, I mean, is there also, does this get to the hesitancy among European and other world officials of, while we have the Biden administration for the next, you know, 3 years, if anything, what we've learned from the Trump administration is that policies can be upended overnight. So even if we do go to a trade agreement, what are some of the larger concerns of the EU in terms of, that some of these decisions could be overruled depending on what happens in our politics, which, as you know, is a little turbulent.
Yes. Anna, the last question is supremely important, but I have to say, we as Europeans, I mean, we always see the United States as the biggest democracy, free, open market in the world, and we've seen the backs and forths in the past few years, in some cases with quite a bit of concern, and we haven't kept it private. But we have no doubt in our minds where this ship is going, and the direction it is as we in Europe. The second thing I would say is that the pandemic and a number of other crises in the past 10 years, whether it was the financial crisis in Europe or the migration crisis or Brexit even, turned out to have made the European Union even stronger every time than before. In the case of the pandemic, the most vivid example of this is the fact that we agreed to borrow together using the collective power of the EU as an economy and not each individual member state's power for the first time in the history, to borrow together 750 billion euros, almost $1 trillion, which is close to the size of the package, the bipartisan one that's being discussed today. But this is fresh money, all of it. We're borrowing from the markets to give to each one of the member states to invest in green growth, in digital growth, and in anything else they need. So this is a massive proof that Europe came out of this stronger than before. This is something we could not agree on to do 10 years ago. So Europe is also stronger. And the fact that Europe is stronger is great news for the United States. As we are facing the common challenges of the world today, whether it's climate change, which is going to be monumentally bigger of a catastrophe if we allow it to get out of hand than COVID has been for our citizens or the citizens of the world, whether it is authoritarianism, whether it is ensuring open and free trade and using the WTO and other organizations around the world, working together with partners, building the partnerships that ensure this happens, so that state subsidies and all these other distorting things don't take over. I mean, in all those things, a strong Europe and a strong US together are unbeatable. And therefore, am I concerned for backslidings in the US, in Europe? We always follow, that's democracy. Politics goes one way or the other, but I'm absolutely sure about the direction, and Europe's increased strength in the past few years, I think should give everyone hope, including in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, and just to wrap up, we've talked about the pandemic. It's upended all of our lives individually. I'm sure our listeners, viewers, readers, I don't know quite how to refer to it anymore, because that too is an example of how everything has very dramatically changed with the pandemic. Can you give us some of your thoughts on how life has changed for you over the last year and a half, for the embassy? And kind of, in general, what are your thoughts on our new Zoom diplomacy, so to speak, and what you're looking forward to in the future?
I'll tell you what, when it comes to, let me separate this. There could be 1,000 ways to separate it, but let me just break it down with, first of all, how the embassy works, an embassy internally, how it produces its work, and then focus at another part of what an embassy is supposed to do, which is public diplomacy. So promoting whatever it is that you do to a broader audience, okay? So internally, it was very interesting. We never expected this. We were never prepared for this. We had to shut down the embassy back in April, then open up just for 25% of the people. We changed everything. Even our embassy now is like an airplane. The European embassy, the air filtration and circulation is 99%, close to 100%. These are massive investments we made to ensure the health and safety of the people working here. But the quality of the work of the people working here, and remember, we are the European Union Embassy, one of the biggest ones in this country by far. Every topic on the agenda, every world topic is a part of the bilateral agenda. You mention it, we discuss it, the European Union, the United States, it's there. And we had to follow the last months of the Trump administration, ensuring that the relationship would stay at least stable. But virtually follow what was probably the most contentious presidential campaign and the most divisive one in many, many, many years, and try to understand and predict for our bosses back in Brussels what might happen, right? Where you actually couldn't.
I don't envy your job right there.
I mean, you couldn't be on the ground, right? I mean, it all had to be this way, right? But you couldn't smell, taste, touch, understand, talk. Then we had to deal with a new president elected in a transition period of a few months, where again it was all virtual. So it was extremely difficult to prepare, and yet right there, in the middle of that, in December 2020, we came out with what Europe calls the joint communication. We, the Europeans, came out with a blueprint with concrete proposals on how the EU-U.S. relationship could go to another super successful level. And if you look at the joint communication of this summit on the 15th of June, you see how many elements of that European effort, that work we did together with headquarters in Brussels, are reflected in there. And then, of course, virtually again, we had to create relationships with the new administration, make sure that our commissioners in Brussels, our secretaries of this and that, would have immediate meetings with your secretaries here in the US, who are being bombarded by everyone around the world for the same thing.
Right.
And we were very successful. So I have to say, I am proud of what the 120 people in this embassy did. Now, what we lost was the intangibles, and we're getting them back by being back together again. You become very good at being transactional. So I have a meeting like this, I know what I want to discuss. We need a note on what the US elections mean. Someone writes it, they take 4 days, it's written, it's gone. That's transactional, it's important. But all the cross-pollination of ideas, what makes an embassy, especially diplomacy, as you know, is a contact sport. What makes it work? That was gone. So we became very good at transactional, but we lost another element, we're getting it back. Now, when it comes to public communication, that was a revolution. I mean, we had events in the past on every single topic. We would have about 50, 100 people in a room, and that was considered a success. In the last major conference we had on the EU and the US Future Forum, we called it, back in May, we had more than 250 people, 1,000 people who at some point or another watched it. It's crazy. So now we're thinking very hard, how do we go back to the physical events, the in-person events, which are very important, because that's where we network as a diplomat, but ensure that we manage to keep the virtual element intact. For all those people who want to watch and participate, but cannot be in Washington or to do it. So it is a pain. It is not easy. I don't know how you guys are going to do it at the Washington.
We don't know.
You don't? You have to tell me. Because
I was hoping you had the answers.
I mean, look. I mean, it's. I mean, you need to be. I mean, fundamentally, look. I mean, there are some events that are obviously intended to be small networking, brainstorming ones. Those will be in person, and they probably will not have a hybrid component. Then there are some events that are supposed to be huge events, right? Where you need to engage with audiences and speakers from all over the world. Those events, for all I know, will remain hybrid in the future, or fundamentally hybrid. And then you have the big majority of events that are somewhere in the middle. And those are the ones that we need to create a blueprint to decide when it is hybrid, when it is in person, when it is virtual. And we're not there yet, but we're getting there. No rest for the weary.
No, exactly. And, for me personally, I remember well over a year ago, and I'm sure possibly quite a few diplomats can relate, where you get to a point during the week where you say, oh my gosh, the millionth reception, I don't know if I can go. And now you're like, oh, I would really like a chance to wear, nice clothes again and see people in person again.
Absolutely.
So, be careful.
Well, I've started,
what you
and,
wish for.
let me just say, I've started now having dinners again and all that stuff. I'm still very careful, so I'm not packing the room. No, and please, everyone listening, I don't care if you're vaccinated, wear your mask. I mean, I sound like some, some Greek Fauci here, and I don't mean to, but I mean, seriously, let's keep a distance a little bit. We just don't know what's happening, right? But of course, we have to be relieved that we're vaccinated, those who are, and those who are not, get your vaccination. But I'll tell you, after vaccination, the dinners I have, where people are feeling finally able to go out, usually dinners are what, from 6:30 to 9 maybe,
Yeah.
right? And then people actually, find an excuse to go home. People won't leave the house. They won't leave the house. I mean, people stay, and sometimes it's 10, something like. In a recent dinner I had, because I had a very early next morning engagement, I had to go to my very important guest and say at some point, people, if you want to stay, I have to retire. And the answer was not, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, of course we'll leave. The answer was, oh, okay, good night. Good night. Well, we'll let ourselves out eventually. So
your house is preferable to the houses they've been confined to for well over a year.
I don't know, but I'll tell you, I think people are thirsting to be exactly as you say, to put on something nice, to just be out with each other, and we are doing this much more now. But please, again, try to be careful.
Yes. No, excellent message. And as always, Ambassador, you are so gracious with your time with us. We truly appreciate it, whether it's virtual or hopefully soon in person again. And thank you to our audience as well. We will continue doing virtual events, and we will be readapting as well to in-person events in the fall. So please stay tuned. And once again, Ambassador, it was great to see you. Thank you so much for the talk, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.